Franklin had not been in the ground for 18 hours, but the moving truck was already at the gate. Dorothea heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of a large vehicle on the gravel drive, the hydraulic hiss of the lift gate, the voices of men who had been hired to move things and were doing their job without knowing whose things they were moving or why the timing was what it was. She stood at the window of the bedroom she had shared with Franklin for 22 years and looked out at the drive in the early morning light. Garrett was at the front door. He had a folder under his arm and the particular composure of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment for a long time and has finally arrived at it. He was dressed for business, not for grief, not for the morning after his father's funeral, but for a transaction. He came into the entrance hall and looked at the grandfather clock, the one that had been in the Whitmore family for 3 generations, the one Franklin had wound every Sunday morning for as long as Dorothea had known him, the one that was still keeping its time as if nothing in the world had changed. Garrett looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. He said, "This estate belongs to the Whitmore family, Dorothea. You were the second wife. Your name is not in the original will. I think you understand what that means." She looked at him. He was not wrong about the will. The original will. Franklin's first written before their marriage, before 22 years of a life built together, did not include her in the primary distribution of the estate. Garrett had found it. He had been looking for it, she understood now, for longer than she had known he was looking. What he had not found was the other thing. What he did not know was that Franklin had never been the kind of man who left the people he loved to fight battles he could have prevented. He had said it to her once, not as a statement of philosophy, but as a quiet declaration of intention, the way he said things that mattered. A wise man doesn't make his wife fight. He removes the fight before it begins. 2 years before he died, Franklin had sat down with Cecil Marsh and signed a document that did not go into the probate file and was not kept in any bank vault that Garrett knew to look in. It was in a navy blue folder tied with white ribbon prepared in Franklin's own hand. On the cover in his handwriting, "For Dot, your armor." She had read those words the evening he gave it to her. She had not fully understood them then. She understood them now, standing in the entrance hall of Magnolia Grove, while her husband's son gestured at the grandfather clock and the moving truck idled at the gate. Garrett had signed a contract. He had sold something to a hotel development group for $4.2 million. He had done it the day his father was buried with the confidence of a man who had done his research and believed he knew exactly what he owned. He had never asked about the trust. Franklin had been counting on that. The Navy folder was in the bedroom. Dot went to get it. The reception lasted 3 hours. Dorothea had stood in the church hall and received people the way she had received difficult things her entire life, with her full attention, with the particular grace of a woman who understands that grief is not something you perform, but something you inhabit, and that the people coming to offer condolences deserve to be met with the same presence they are bringing. She had shaken hands and accepted embraces and said thank you, and yes, he was. And we had a good life, and I know, and all the other true things that needed to be said, and she had meant every word of every one of them. Franklin had been a good man. They had had a good life. She knew. Isabel had stayed close throughout her daughter from her first marriage, 37 years old, and steady in the way she had always been steady, the kind of presence that does not demand to be noticed, but is simply always where it is needed. She had driven Dorothea to the church and sat beside her in the front pew, and stood near her at the reception, and now drove her home along the familiar road to Magnolia Grove in the November afternoon. They saw the truck from the end of the drive. A large moving truck, white with the logo of a removal company Dorothea did not recognize. It was parked at the side of the main entrance with its rear doors open, and 2 men were standing beside it with the patient posture of people waiting for direction. Isabel said, "Me." Dorothea said, "I see it." She said it quietly, not with alarm, not with the sharp intake of a person encountering a shock, but with the specific flatness of someone who has been preparing for something and is now watching it arrive. She had known somewhere in the part of herself that had been watching Garrett for 22 years that this was coming. She had not known it would be today. She had thought she might have a day, perhaps two. She had apparently been wrong about that. Isabel parked behind the truck. They went inside. Up! Garrett was in the entrance hall with 3 men in suits. He had changed out of his funeral clothes. He was in a jacket and pressed shirt, the jacket of a man who has moved from one kind of meeting to another and is dressed accordingly. The 3 men with him had the practiced, attentive look of people conducting a site visit, looking at the ceiling height, the original moldings, the proportions of the rooms, the way the afternoon light came through the tall windows at the south end of the hall. One of them was photographing the grandfather clock. The clock had stood in that hall for 3 generations of Whitmores. Franklin had wound it every Sunday morning for 30 years. She had heard him do it, the small ritual of it, the brief pause he always made afterward to listen to the pendulum catch and begin. She had thought of it this morning when she woke up and realized he was not there to wind it, and had not yet decided what to do with that. Garrett looked up when Dorothea came in. He said, "Dorothea, good. I was going to have someone call you." She said, "What is this, Garrett?" He reached into the folder under his arm and produced a document. He held it out to her, not offered exactly, but presented in the way that legal documents are presented when the person presenting them wants the weight of the paper to do the work. She took it. It was a will. Franklin's name at the top, the formal language of a document properly executed, the date 26 years ago, before their marriage, before the 22 years of a life she and Franklin had built in this house. She read the relevant section. The estate known as Magnolia Grove, including all structures and improvements on the property at the listed address to pass to the Whitmore family bloodline in perpetuity, administered by the eldest male heir upon the death of Franklin Whitmore. She looked up at Garrett. He said, "Dad loved you. I've accepted that." But love doesn't create legal ownership, Dorothea. A will is what speaks in court. He paused in the manner of a man who has prepared this sentence in advance and is delivering it on schedule. Your name is not in this will. You have no legal claim to Magnolia Grove. He reached into the folder again. Another document, thicker, the kind produced by a commercial transaction, multiple pages with tabs marking the signature lines. He said, "I signed a purchase agreement this morning with Harmon Hospitality Group, $4.2 million. They're converting Magnolia Grove into a boutique hotel. Closing is in 60 days. He set it on the hall table with the particular placement of a man putting down a settled matter. I'd ask you to be out in 30 days. That gives you 2 weeks before we need access for the renovation team." The 3 men in suits had continued their slow circuit of the hall during this exchange, professional, unhurried, the way people behave when they are confident the decision has already been made, and they are simply surveying what they will be working with. Pamela came in from the dining room. She had been in there, Dorothea realized had been in the house before they arrived, moving through the rooms, with the ownership that comes from believing something is already yours. She crossed the hall toward the architect type in the group and gestured at the grandfather clock with the authority of a woman who has been planning this for a long time and is now simply executing. She said, "That clock needs to come down first. It doesn't work with the modern concept." Dorothea looked at the clock. Franklin had wound it every Sunday for 30 years. His father had wound it before him. His grandfather had carried it from the original Whitmore house when they moved to Magnolia Grove, had positioned it in this hall, himself had said, "According to family story, that a house with a clock like this one knows what time it is, even when the people in it have forgotten." Isabel touched her arm. She said very low, close to Dorothea's ear, "We need to call an attorney. Right now, I can." Dorothea said equally low, "No." Isabel looked at her. Dorothea said, "Go upstairs. In the bedroom closet on the left side behind the winter coats, there's a folder. Navy blue white ribbon. Bring it to me." Isabel looked at her for a moment longer, trying to read something in her face, trying to understand the quality of her mother's calm, which was not the calm of a woman in shock or a woman resigned, but something else, something that Isabel did not yet have a name for. Then she went upstairs. Garrett was speaking to the men in suits again, square footage, structural assessments, the timeline for permits. Pamela was making notes on her phone. The men were moving toward the back of the house. Dorothea stood in the entrance hall beside the grandfather clock and waited. She thought about the last evening Franklin was well enough to be in this hall the week before he went to the hospital for the final time. He had wound the clock as always on that Sunday morning. And that evening he had found her in the sitting room and sat down beside her and placed a navy blue folder in her hands, tied with a white ribbon, his handwriting on the cover. He had said, "Dot, if something happens to me, don't argue with Garrett. Don't explain yourself. Don't try to make him understand. Just open this." She had said, "Franklin." He had said, "Promise me you'll open it first, before anything else."
She had promised.
Isabel came back down the stairs. She was carrying the folder navy blue-white ribbon intact, exactly as Franklin had left it. She crossed the hall and held it out to her mother. Dorothea took it in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, not in physical weight, in the weight of what it represented. 2 years of Franklin's planning, his quiet preparation, the specific, careful foresight of a man who had known what was coming and had decided without drama to make sure it could not arrive the way Garrett intended. She held it against her chest for a moment. She closed her eyes. She heard as clearly as if he were beside her the particular quality of Franklin's voice when he said things that mattered, unhurried, specific, the voice of a man who means exactly what he says and has chosen the words carefully. She heard, "I remove the fight before it began." She opened her eyes. Garrett was still talking to the men in suits. Pamela was still on her phone. The grandfather clock was still keeping its time. Dorothea stood in the entrance hall of Magnolia Grove, her home. Franklin's home, the home that was about to stop being mistakenly believed to belong to anyone other than her. And she held the navy folder in both hands and thought about what came next. What came next was very simple. She was going to open it. The notice arrived by courier at 9 o'clock the following morning. It was in a legal envelope, the kind with the law firm's name printed on the upper left corner in the formal type of an established practice, Hargrove and Associates, the firm Garrett had retained, whose name Dorothea had not known before yesterday and now would not forget. The envelope was addressed to Dorothea Whitmore, which was the name she had taken when she married Franklin, and which Garrett had never once used when speaking to her, directly preferring Dorothea in the tone that made it clear he considered the Whitmore to be a courtesy at best. She opened it at the kitchen table. The notice was 2 pages. It was courteous in its language and absolute in its content. It informed her that the estate known as Magnolia Grove had been contracted for sale under the authority of Franklin Whitmore's last will and testament dated 26 years prior, and that as a non-primary beneficiary under that instrument, she was entitled to remove her personal effects from the property within 30 days of the notice date. It informed her that any attempt to interfere with the sale process or remain on the property beyond the 30-day period would constitute unlawful occupancy. It informed her that the closing date had been scheduled and that access for renovation assessment would begin in 3 weeks. It was signed by an attorney she had never met on behalf of Garrett Whitmore. She read it once. Then she folded it along its crease and placed it in the navy folder beside the documents she had been reading the previous 2 evenings, and she made herself a second cup of coffee and went to the window and looked out at the rose garden. Franklin had planted the first rose in that garden the spring after they were married. Every year since he had added one more, a new variety chosen for reasons he rarely explained, set in the ground with the careful attention of a man who understood that the things worth having were worth tending. The garden now had 22 roses, one for each year of their marriage, each in its late-season state of bare canes and mulched earth, waiting for the spring they would bloom again. Pamela had told the architect it needed to be torn out entirely. She came every day. This was the thing Dorothea had not fully anticipated, not the legal notice which she had expected, but Pamela's daily presence. She arrived each morning with a measuring tape and a color board, and the focused energy of a woman executing a project she had been planning for longer than the project had been officially underway, which told Dorothea something about the timeline of Garrett's intentions that she filed away carefully. Pamela moved through the rooms of Magnolia Grove with the ownership of someone who has decided the house is already hers, measuring window frames and photographing ceiling details and consulting with the architect who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She spoke about the house in the future tense, and in the third person the lobby would be here, The restaurant would occupy this wing. The spa would require the removal of the back garden structures. The back garden structures included the small chapel. It was not large, a single-room, white-painted wood with 4 pews and a window that faced east and caught the morning light in the specific way of windows that had been positioned with intention rather than accident. Franklin had built it himself the first winter after they moved to Magnolia Grove, because Dorothea had mentioned once that she missed having a quiet place to think. They had exchanged their vows there privately a year after their civil ceremony, in a ceremony that was only the two of them, and the morning light through the east window. Pamela told the architect it would need to come down to create room for a parking expansion. Dorothea was standing 6 feet away when she said it. She said nothing. Isabel found her in the rose garden that afternoon. She had been watching from the kitchen window. Dorothea could tell from the specific expression on her daughter's face. When she came outside, the expression of a woman who has been watching someone absorbs difficult things and has reached the limit of her capacity to observe without intervening. Isabel said, "Me. Why aren't you saying anything to them? Why are you letting her walk through our house?" And Dorothea said, "It's not their house." Isabel said, "They don't know that." Dorothea looked at the rose garden, at the 22 canes in their winter state, each one waiting, at the specific ordering of them that Franklin had maintained the varieties he had chosen, the progression of colors from the south end of the bed to the north, the one he had planted most recently this past spring, a deep red that he had said was for their anniversary year. She said Franklin already said everything that needed to be said. They just haven't heard it yet. Isabel looked at her for a long moment, trying to read the quality of her mother's stillness, trying to determine whether it was peace or suppression or something else entirely. She said, "When will they hear it?" Dorothea said, "When Cecil Marsh tells them." Garrett had scheduled a meeting with attorney Cecil Marsh for Thursday afternoon. She knew because he had called Marsh's office directly, and the receptionist had mentioned it when Dorothea called the same morning to confirm her own appointment for the following week. Garrett had requested the meeting to review the estate distribution timeline, to address any procedural questions regarding the will's execution, and to establish that no legal challenges to the sale would be entertained. He had done this with the confidence of a man who believes he is managing a process. He did not know that Cecil Marsh had been Franklin's attorney for 30 years. He did not know that Marsh had been present in this house 2 years ago, when Franklin had signed the trust documents, had sat at the dining room table with his briefcase open and his pen ready, while Franklin read each page carefully and asked the questions that needed asking and signed where the instrument required. He did not know that Marsh held the original trust document in his office in a file marked with Franklin's name, with a notation that specified the conditions under which it was to be produced. He did not know any of this because he had not asked. He had assumed that an old will was sufficient, and that assumption had felt so solid, so confirmed by everything he had found in Franklin's desk and filing cabinet, that he had not thought to look further. Franklin had been counting on that. That night, after the house was quiet and Isabel had gone to bed in the guest room, Dorothea sat at the desk in the study with the Navy folder open in front of her. She had read the trust documents twice now, once on the night Franklin first gave her the folder, and once in the 2 days since his funeral. She understood them well enough. The revocable living trust established 2 years before his death, transferring Magnolia Grove and its associated property into the trust structure. Dorothea named as trustee. The provision that made the trust irrevocable at Franklin's death, at which point she became the sole trustee with full authority over the asset. The legal language that placed the property entirely outside the probate estate, outside the reach of the will, outside the reach of Garrett's claims, outside the reach of any sale conducted without her authorization. She turned to the back of the folder. She had been to the back of the folder before twice. She knew the arrangement of the documents. She knew the trust instrument and the physician's statement and the notary's certification. She had not, either time, looked quite carefully enough at the very last item. It was small, a standard envelope sealed, tucked into the folder's back pocket so neatly that it sat flush with the pocket's edge and could be easily overlooked. Her name on the front in Franklin's handwriting, not the formal print he used for documents. His personal script, the looser, more intimate version, the handwriting she had read on birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen counter, and the margins of books he thought she should read. Beneath her name, 2 lines. Only read this when you need to. You'll know when. She had not opened it. She had known both times she had reached the back of the folder that the moment was not right, that she was still in the part of the story that required patience and observation and the specific kind of trust that comes from believing in a person's preparation even before you fully understand what they have prepared. She sat at the desk with the envelope in her hands. She thought about what Franklin had said in the rose garden on a late afternoon in the last year of his life, when she had found him sitting on the bench at the south end looking at the roses with the particular expression he had when he was thinking about something he had not yet finished thinking through. He had looked up when she sat beside him and said, "Dot, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm only afraid you won't know how strong you are." She had said, "I know how strong I am, Franklin." He had taken her hand. He had said, "You know it in ordinary times. I want you to know it when they make it hard." She set the envelope back in the folder. Not yet, but soon. The meeting with Cecil Marsh was Thursday. She would know when. She opened the envelope on a Wednesday night. Not because anything had changed. Pamela had been at the house again that afternoon with her measuring tape, and her architect, and the rose garden was still scheduled for removal, and the 30-day notice was still in the Navy folder. But because something in the quality of the evening told her the time had arrived. The particular stillness of the house after Isabel had gone to bed. The way the study felt Franklin's presence in it, the books on his shelves, the pen set on the desk, that she had not moved the specific quality of a room that holds a person long after the person is gone. She knew when. She opened the envelope carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting for you and deserves to be received without haste. A single folded page. His handwriting, the personal script, the one he used for things that were not formal but were important, the one she had been reading for 22 years and would know anywhere on any surface in any light. 4 lines. Dot. Garrett will look for the will. I let him find it. But Magnolia Grove is no longer in the will. I moved it out 2 years ago. The folder tells you everything. Trust Cecil. Trust yourself. I love you. Go home, F. She read it once. She sat for a moment with the page in her hands and let the 4 lines be what they were, small, plain, the most essential thing Franklin had ever said to her, compressed into the form that fit a single page tucked into the back pocket of a Navy folder. He had let Garrett find the will. She understood it now with the full clarity of a woman receiving the final piece of something she has been assembling without knowing she was assembling it. The old will, 26 years old, the one Garrett had produced with such confidence, the one that spoke of the Whitmore bloodline and the eldest male heir. Franklin had known it was there. Had known Garrett knew it was there. Had known that Garrett, given the opportunity, would go to the desk and the filing cabinet and find it and take it as the settled answer to a question he had already decided to ask. So Franklin had left it where Garrett could find it. And 2 years before that, he had moved the actual asset quietly, legally, with Cecil Marsh at the dining room table, and the proper documents signed and notarized and filed out of the estate entirely. Garrett had spent however long he had been planning this, preparing to fight for a document that described property it no longer governed. He had signed a contract with Harmon Hospitality based on authority he did not have to sell property that had not been his to sell for 2 years. The will was real. The will was valid. The will simply did not include Magnolia Grove because Magnolia Grove was no longer part of the estate the will distributed. Franklin had removed the fight before it began. He had done it 2 years in advance so quietly that no one had known to look for it. She turned to the trust document. She had read it twice before, once on the night Franklin gave her the folder, and once in the days since the funeral. But she read it again now with the specific attention of a person who has just received the key to something and is ready to understand what it unlocks. The Franklin and Dorothea Whitmore Family Trust, established 2 years prior. Franklin and Dorothea as co-trustees during Franklin's lifetime. Upon Franklin's death, the trust converting automatically to irrevocable status with Dorothea named as the sole surviving trustee with full legal authority over all trust assets. The trust assets, Magnolia Grove Estate, and all improvements thereon, including the main house grounds, outbuildings, and chapel. The operative language was clear in the way that careful legal drafting is clear, not because it was simple, but because every word had been chosen to mean exactly one thing and not permit another interpretation. The property had been conveyed into the trust 2 years ago. From that date, it was no longer Franklin's personal property to distribute through his will. It was a trust asset. And the trustee of that asset from the moment of Franklin's death was Dorothea, not Garrett, not Harmon Hospitality, not the sum of any contract signed without her knowledge or authorization. Dorothea. The sale was void, had been void from the moment Garrett signed the contract because he had signed it as if he owned something he did not own, had never owned, had been legally prevented from owning for 2 years. She turned further in the folder and found the physician's statement, Franklin's doctor, the same man who had treated him for 15 years, signing a document on the date the trust was executed, attesting to Franklin's full mental competency and his clear understanding of the legal and financial implications of the transaction. Dated, notarized, specific. Franklin had anticipated the challenge Garrett would make, had foreclosed it before Garrett had thought to make it. She found herself thinking about the evening they had signed the trust documents, the dining room table, Cecil Marsh's briefcase, the particular seriousness of a legal proceeding conducted in the room where they ate breakfast. She had asked Franklin why they were doing this, exactly what problem they were solving. He had looked at her with the patient expression he wore when he was explaining something he had already thought through completely. He had said, "You don't need to understand all of the law, Dot. You just need to keep this folder. I've understood it for both of us." She had kept the folder. He had been right. She picked up her phone. Cecil Marsh's number was in her contacts under the name Franklin had given it Frank's lawyer, which was the kind of informal labeling Franklin used for things he wanted to be able to find quickly and without ceremony. She had called it twice in the years of their marriage for ordinary matters, and once on the day Franklin was admitted to the hospital for the final time, and each time Marsh had answered with the composed attentiveness of a man who takes every call seriously. She pressed call. 2 rings, Marsh answered. She said, "Cecil, it's Dorothea Whitmore. I think it's time." There was a pause on his end, brief, the pause of a man confirming something he has been expecting, rather than processing something new. Then his voice low and measured, "I've been waiting for this call, Dorothea. How are you holding up?" She said, "I'm holding up fine. I read the folder." He said, "All of it." She said, "Including Franklin's note, yes." Another pause warmer than the first. He said he wrote that the afternoon we finished the signing, sat at the dining room table after I left and wrote it and put it in the folder himself. He told me he was going to leave a note. He didn't tell me what it said. She looked at the 4 lines on the page in front of her. She said he moved the property out of the will 2 years ago and that Garrett would find the old will and think it was sufficient. He said to trust you. Marsh said he was right about Garrett, and he was right to trust me. She said, "I know. What happens now?" Marsh said, "I file an emergency motion to halt the sale. I contact the buyer's counsel directly with the trust documentation and the recording date. The contract is void, has been since the moment Garrett signed it because he had no legal authority to convey the property. Once the buyer's team sees the trust instrument, they'll withdraw. They don't want the liability of a fraudulent conveyance." He paused. He said Garrett has also exposed himself to significant personal liability. Misrepresenting ownership in a commercial transaction of this size is not a minor matter. She said, "I understand." He said, "I'll need you in my office Thursday morning, 8 o'clock before Garrett arrives for his meeting. I want the full picture on the table before he walks in." She said, "I'll be there." She set the phone on the desk. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the study, Franklin's books on the shelves, the pen set on the desk, the specific quality of a room that knows it is loved. She heard the door behind her. Isabel came in still in her robe, her hair loose, the expression of a daughter who has been listening for the quality of sounds from the study and has come because the quality of the silence has changed in a way she could not ignore. She looked at Dorothea, at the open folder, at the 4-line note on the desk, at the phone face-up beside it. She said, "Me. Are you all right?" Dorothea looked at her daughter. "She said your father took care of everything, Isabel. He took care of all of it." She said it the way she said things that were simply true, without emphasis, without the drama of a revelation, with the plain clarity of a person who has been handed the full picture and is now seeing it completely for the first time. She said, "We're going to Cecil Marsh's office in the morning, and then we're coming home." Isabel looked at the folder, at the documents, at her mother sitting straight-backed at Franklin's desk with the calm expression of a woman who has stopped waiting and is ready to act. She said, "He planned all of this." Dorothea said, "He planned all of this." She closed the folder. She tied the white ribbon across the cover. She set it in the center of the desk where she would find it in the morning. She looked at the study, the room Franklin had worked in, thought in, planned in, sat in on the evenings when he was working through something he did not yet want to explain. He had been working through this for 2 years quietly in the way he did everything that mattered. He had moved the fight out of reach before the fight arrived. And now it was Thursday morning, and Cecil Marsh was waiting, and Garrett was going to walk into a meeting he thought he had arranged on his own terms, and he was going to discover what it meant to have underestimated a man like Franklin Whitmore. Dorothea turned off the desk lamp. She went to bed. She slept soundly for the first time since the funeral in the way of a person who has found what she was looking for and knows exactly where she stands. Garrett and Pamela arrived at the law offices of Hargrove and Associates at 8:45, 15 minutes early. The particular earliness of people who want to be established in a room before others arrive, who want the table to feel like theirs, the positions to be chosen, the psychological geometry of the space arranged in their favor before the formalities begin. Pamela was in a cream blazer. Garrett had a new suit charcoal, the kind purchased for an occasion the buyer expects to mark the beginning of something. They had coffee brought in. They spoke to the paralegal with the ease of people who believe the paperwork is a formality. They arranged their folders on the table with the efficiency of people who have done their preparation and are waiting for the world to confirm what they already know. The Harmon hospitality team arrived at 9. 3 of them, the transaction attorney, a senior acquisitions officer, and a woman whose precise role, Dorothea would later learn, was title review, whose job it was to ensure that what was being purchased was in fact owned by the person selling it. They set up at the far end of the table with their own materials, opened their laptops, and began the procedural work of confirming what the morning's signing was expected to confirm. The title search was the first item. Dorothea had been in Cecil Marsh's office since 8 o'clock. She had sat across from him at the same desk where she imagined Franklin had sat 2 years ago to plan the architecture of what she was now walking into. Marsh had gone through everything, the trust instrument, the recording documentation, the physician's statement, the chain of title that showed clearly when the property had been conveyed into the trust and under what terms. He had answered her questions with the patience of a man who has been holding information for 2 years and is finally in the process of deploying it in the way it was designed to be deployed. He had said Franklin was very precise about the timing. He wanted the trust recorded early enough that no one could claim it was executed under duress or in anticipation of a specific dispute. 2 years gives it exactly the kind of distance that makes it unchallengeable on those grounds. She had said he planned the timing, too. Marsh had said Franklin planned everything. That was who he was. She knew that. She had known it for 22 years. She had watched him think through problems with the systematic patience of a man who did not trust improvisation with the things that mattered, who believed that the best preparation was the kind done so far in advance that it looked like simple fact rather than strategy. She had not known until this week how fully he had applied that quality to protecting her. At 9:15, Marsh received a text from his contact at the title company, a brief confirmation that the title search had been run and that the result was exactly what the trust documentation said it would be. He looked at Dorothea. He said, "It's time." She walked into the conference room at 9:22, navy folder under her arm, black dress the one she had worn to the funeral 2 days ago, because she had decided that morning that she would not change, that the clothes she had worn to bury her husband were the right clothes for this, the continuation of that day's business. Her silver hair was combed back. She wore no jewelry except the small gold earrings Franklin had given her on their first anniversary, which she had put on that morning with the specific intention of wearing something his hands had touched. Cecil Marsh came through the door directly behind her. The room went still. Garrett looked up from his coffee. The quality of his stillness in the moment he saw her was not the stillness of surprise. It was the stillness of a man recalculating, which is a different thing. He had known she might attempt something. He had not known what form it would take, or that it would take the form of walking through the door of his closing meeting with a Navy folder and an attorney who had been Franklin's lawyer for 30 years. Pamela's hand moved to Garrett's arm. Dorothea crossed the room and pulled out the chair directly across from Garrett and sat down. She placed the Navy folder on the table. She did not open it. She did not need to open it. She set it on the polished surface between them and let it be there, the object that represented 2 years of Franklin's quiet preparation present in the room waiting. She said to the room generally and to no one specifically, "Good morning." The Harmon hospitality attorney, a woman in her 50s named Reeves, with the precise manner of someone who has spent her career ensuring that what her clients purchase is actually available to be purchased, looked up from her laptop. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, before we proceed, I need to clarify something that has come up in the title review." Garrett said, "Of course, whatever you need." His tone was the tone of confident accommodation, the tone that says, "I have nothing to hide, and am happy to assist with your procedural questions." Reeves turned her laptop to face the table. The title search results were on the screen. Property address, parcel number, legal description, the standard display of a county record search organized in the flat, informational way of government databases. In the field marked Current Owner of Record, the text read, Franklin and Dorothea Whitmore Family Trust, Dorothea Whitmore, sole surviving trustee. Established March 14, 2022. Recorded Chatham County Register of Deeds Instrument Number 2022-RT-0847. Reeves said the property is held in a trust established 2 years ago. The current trustee is Dorothea Whitmore. She is the sole party with legal authority to convey this property. This is not reflected in the purchase agreement you presented to us, which identified you as the seller in your individual capacity as heir under a testamentary instrument. She said it in the measured professional tone of a woman stating facts, rather than making accusations, which was more effective than any accusation because it left no room for the kind of emotional response that accusations sometimes invite. Garrett said it's a technical issue, an administrative matter that can be... He stopped, because Cecil Marsh had opened his briefcase and placed a document on the table, not a copy. The original trust instrument, the one that had been in Marsh's files for 2 years, held in the sealed folder Franklin had prepared with the instruction to produce it when the moment required. The notary's seal was visible. The recording stamp from Chatham County was in the corner, the red ink of the official mark clear and unambiguous. Marsh said this is the original executed trust instrument recorded with Chatham County on March 14, 2022. The property was legally conveyed into this trust on that date by Franklin Whitmore with full legal capacity, as attested by his physician on the same day. Dorothea Whitmore was named co-trustee at the time of establishment and became sole surviving trustee upon Franklin's death. The property has not been part of the probate estate at any point. The will Mr. Whitmore has been relying on has no authority over this asset. He set the document on the table in front of the notary, the man who had been sitting at the head of the table in his professional neutrality and who was now looking at the Chatham County recording stamp with the specific attention of a professional confirming something he needed to confirm before he could proceed with anything. He said, "I cannot notarize this transaction without verification that the seller has authority to convey." Garrett said, there must be some... Pamela's hand tightened on his arm. The Harmon Hospitality Acquisitions Officer, who had been silent since Dorothea entered the room, leaned toward Reeves and said something low and specific. Reeves listened. She nodded once. Then Reeves looked at Garrett. she said. Mr. Whitmore, can you explain to us how a property listed under a trust of which you are not a trustee appeared in a purchase agreement that represented you as having authority to sell it? The room was quiet. Garrett looked at Dorothea. She looked back, not with triumph, not with the performance of victory, with the steady, even gaze of a woman who is sitting in the right place with the right document, having done the right thing, and who does not need the room to confirm any of that because it is already confirmed. He said it was an oversight. Reeves said, in our experience, oversight does not typically involve misrepresenting ownership on a $42,000 commercial transaction. She closed her laptop. She said, we need to suspend this closing pending legal review of the title situation. She stood up. The acquisitions officer stood up. The notary began gathering his materials. Pamela, said Garrett. Garrett did not respond. He was looking at the trust instrument on the table, at the Chatham County recording stamp, at the date 2 years in the past, at the name Dorothea Whitmore printed clearly in the trustee line, at the thing Franklin had put in place long before this morning, long before the funeral, long before the moving truck at the gate, long before Garrett had walked into Magnolia Grove with his folder and his new suit and his absolute certainty that everything was already settled. Franklin had been there first. 2 years first, and Dorothea was sitting across from his son with the Navy folder on the table between them, and the grandfather clock at Magnolia Grove was still keeping its time, and the rose garden was still in the ground, and the chapel was still standing, and every room in that house was still exactly as it had been when the door closed on the morning they all needed it to remain. Marsh gathered the trust document and returned it to his briefcase. He looked at Dorothea. She gave him the smallest nod. He said to the room in the tone of a man concluding a matter he came to conclude, I'll be in touch with counsel regarding next steps. He stood. Dorothea stood. She picked up the Navy folder. She looked at Garrett one final time, not with anger, not with pity, but with the plain, clear gaze of a woman who has come to the end of something and is ready to go home. She turned and walked out of the conference room. Behind her, she heard the Harmon hospitality team beginning to make their calls. She did not look back. Garrett's final argument arrived before the hallway door had fully closed behind them. He had been quiet in the conference room during the worst of it, the title search result on the screen, the trust instrument on the table, the Harmon attorneys rising from their chairs. He had been quiet with the specific quality of a man absorbing successive blows and waiting for the right moment to deploy what he still believed he had. He found the moment in the hallway. He said my father was not himself when he signed that document. The words came with the pressure of a man who has been holding them and is now releasing them with everything he has left. Not the polished confidence of the conference room, something rawer, the last card of a man who has watched the others fail. He said he was ill. He was being isolated. He gestured toward Dorothea without looking at her directly. She had been managing his affairs for months before that signing. He trusted her completely, and she used that trust to steer him into a legal arrangement that cut me out entirely. That is undue influence. I will file on those grounds and I will be heard. Marsh had continued walking when Garrett started speaking. He stopped now, not in response to urgency, but with the deliberate quality of a man who is prepared for this moment and is now arriving at it. He turned. He set his briefcase on the small hallway table. He opened it. He said, "Let me show you something, Garrett." The first document was the physician's statement. Marsh placed it on the table with the flat, unhurried placement of a man presenting evidence rather than making an argument. Franklin's doctor, the same physician who had treated him for 15 years, who knew his medical history and his baseline and the specific characteristics of his cognition under the pressures of illness, had signed a formal statement on the exact date the trust was executed. The letterhead, the credentials, the date matching the trust instrument exactly. The language was unambiguous in the way that medical statements are unambiguous. When a physician has been asked to be precise, patient demonstrates full cognitive competency, decision-making capacity intact, understanding of legal and financial implications confirmed through direct examination, no evidence of coercion, confusion, or diminished capacity, examination conducted at patient's request for the specific purpose of documenting voluntary intent. Marsh said Franklin arranged this examination himself. He called the physician's office. He scheduled the appointment for the same morning as the trust signing. He did not tell his doctor why until he arrived and explained that he was executing a significant legal instrument and wanted his capacity on the record. He paused. He said he anticipated your argument, Garrett. He prepared the rebuttal before you made the argument. Garrett said, "That's—" Marsh reached into the briefcase again. He produced a second envelope, sealed the outside bearing a label in Marsh's handwriting to be opened in the event of a challenge to the trust instrument Franklin Whitmore, March 2022. He opened it. He unfolded the single page and read aloud in the quiet hallway in the measured voice of a man reading something that deserves to be heard completely. To whoever needs to read this, if this letter is being opened, then the trust has been challenged. I want to say the following for the record clearly and without ambiguity. I was not coerced. I was not confused. I was not managed by my wife or by anyone else. Dorothea did not know the full extent of what I was preparing until I chose to tell her. She did not ask me to do this. She did not suggest it. The decision was mine, made alone in full possession of my faculties with the advice of my attorney and the confirmation of my physician on the same day. I have known Garrett for 48 years. I love him. I also know him. I know what he will do when the will is read and the trust becomes known. I know what arguments he will make. I have prepared for each of them. If Garrett is reading this letter, it means he has tried everything available to him, and everything was insufficient. That was the plan. Franklin Whitmore. March 14th, 2022. Marsh folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. The hallway was very quiet. Garrett looked at the envelope, at the physician's statement, at the date on both of them, the same date 2 years ago, a Tuesday, in March, when Franklin had woken up and driven to his doctor's office and then to Marsh's office, and had sat at the dining room table and signed a document that protected his wife from precisely this conversation. Pamela stood beside him. She had been beside him through all of it in the conference room in this hallway, through the Harmon attorneys and the title search and the trust instrument and all of it. She had been the other half of the plan, the person who had measured the rooms with the measuring tape and told the architect which walls to remove and scheduled the demolition of the chapel. She looked at Garrett now. She said, "I told you to check the title before you signed anything. I said it 3 weeks ago. I said we needed a full title search before we approached Harmon. You said the will was sufficient. You said you had handled it." Garrett said, "Pamela," she said, "I told you. I told you specifically." And you said she stopped. She shook her head not with anger, but with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been right and would have preferred to have been wrong. The fracture in the partnership of their ambition was visible and specific, and had the particular quality of a structure revealing under pressure that it had never been as solid as it appeared. Garrett looked away from her. The Harmon hospitality attorney Reeves, who had followed them into the hallway with the focused attention of a professional protecting her client's interests, said in the measured tone of a woman delivering a formal position, "Harmon Hospitality considers the purchase agreement void ab initio. You represented yourself as having authority to convey this property. You did not have that authority. Whether you knew about the trust or failed to conduct the due diligence that would have revealed it, the result for our client is the same. We committed resources, time, and professional effort to a transaction that could not legally close. She said our legal team will be in contact regarding our options, which include claims for fraudulent misrepresentation and tortious interference. I would recommend you speak with counsel as soon as possible." She turned and walked toward the elevator with her colleague. Garrett's own attorney leaned toward him and said something low and brief. Garrett listened without responding. Dorothea had been standing at the edge of this exchange, present still the navy folder under her arm, her coat on the brass keys in her pocket. She had not spoken. She had not needed to speak. Franklin's letters and Franklin's documents and Franklin's 2 years of careful preparation had spoken for her completely and without requiring her to add anything. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out the brass keys. She set them on the hallway table. They landed with the specific weight of old metal, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the solid sound of something substantial resting on a surface. She said, "Franklin gave me these on our 20th anniversary. He held them out in the rose garden and said, 'This is your home dot.' Not because the paperwork says so, because you built it with your own hands alongside me." She looked at Garrett. She said, "I only wanted you to see them." Then she picked them up. She put them back in her pocket. She turned toward the elevator. She did not look back at Garrett or at Pamela or at the physician's statement on the hallway table or the envelope with Franklin's letter in it. She had nothing left to do in this building. Marsh fell into step beside her. He said quietly, "That was well done." She said, "I didn't do anything." He said, "Exactly." The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. The doors closed behind her. Below in the lobby, the ordinary business of a Thursday morning in the county seat was preceding people with briefcases, a delivery coming through the side entrance, the receptionist at the front desk answering a call. The world going about its work entirely unaware of what had happened on the floor above. She stood in the elevator as it descended and held the brass keys in her hand and felt their weight, the specific weight of 22 years of a rose garden and a grandfather clock and a chapel where a man had made a promise and kept it so thoroughly that he had kept it from beyond his own life. The lobby doors opened. She walked out into the November morning. Magnolia Grove was waiting. She was going home. The moving truck was gone. Dorothea noticed this before anything else, the absence of it, the gravel drive empty, in the early morning the way it was supposed to be empty, the way it had been empty for 22 years, of mornings before this week had begun. The gate was closed. The yard was quiet. The November light was coming up over the old oaks at the property line in the particular way it came up at this time of year, low unhurried the light that showed things as they actually were. She had been awake since 5. She had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the early dark the way she had always sat at kitchen tables in the early dark, waiting for the light letting the morning arrive at its own pace before she was required to be anything in particular. She had sat at this specific table for 22 years. She would sit at it tomorrow. That continuity, the plain, unspectacular continuity of a life in a place, was itself a form of answer to everything the week had tried to take from her. At 6, she put on her coat and her garden gloves and went outside. The rose garden was where she began. 22 roses, one for each year of their marriage, each in its November state, the bare canes, the mulched earth, the specific dormancy of living things that are resting rather than finished. She unwound the hose from the tap at the side of the house and started at the south end of the bed, the oldest end, the way Franklin had always started. He had taught her that. 10 from the oldest point toward the newest, respect the order of things. She moved slowly through the garden in the early morning quiet, and she thought about Franklin, not the Franklin of the trust documents and the physician's statement and the letter that had dismantled Garrett's final argument, but the Franklin of these mornings. The Franklin who had wound the grandfather clock every Sunday and planted a new rose every anniversary and built the chapel with his own hands and sat beside her on the bench at the south end of the garden on Sunday afternoons when neither of them had anything particular to say, and neither of them needed to. She thought about 22 years of that. She watered the roses. Helen arrived at 8. 81 years old, the adjacent property, 40 years of knowing Franklin before Dorothea had known him. She came through the side gate with a plate covered in a dish towel and the unhurried gait of a woman who has been moving at her own pace for 8 decades and has stopped apologizing for it. She set the plate on the porch railing. She took Dorothea's hands. She said Franklin chose you because he knew you would keep this place alive. He knew that before he knew anything else about you. He had an eye for people. She said it the way old women say true things plainly without sentiment in the register of a statement that has been observed over time and is being reported accurately. Dorothea said he did know people. Helen said he knew you most of all. She stayed 20 minutes. She did not ask for details about what had happened because she had heard enough through the ordinary channels of a small county and understood enough without needing the rest. She drank half a cup of coffee and looked at the rose garden and at the house and said, "It looks the same." Dorothea said, "It is the same." Helen said, "Good. That's how it should be." She went home. Others came through the morning, the Petersons from the property down the road, a woman from the church who had known Franklin for 30 years, the young couple who had bought the old Hendricks place 2 years ago and barely known him at all, but had come anyway, because they understood at some instinctive level that this was a morning for showing up. They brought flowers and baked things and did not stay long. Each of them said something different. Each of them said the same thing. She received them all at the door and thanked them and watched them go. And in the accumulation of their arrivals and departures, she felt something she had not felt since the morning she found Franklin and sat beside him and held his hand and talked to him about the rose he had planted in the spring. The feeling of being known in a place, of having been somewhere long enough that the place had incorporated you not as a resident or an owner, but as a presence that belonged the way the oaks belonged, the way the clock belonged, the way the garden belonged. She had been here for 22 years. This was her community. It had always been. Isabel found her in the afternoon at the chapel door. She had her palm flat against the old wood, not pushing it open, simply resting her hand on the surface, feeling the specific texture of wood that had been painted and repainted over many years soft at the edges where the November moisture had been working on it for decades. The handle was worn smooth from use. The hinges were the original ones, slightly dark with age. Pamela had scheduled this building for demolition. It was still standing. Isabel came to stand beside her. She said, "Me. Did you know from the beginning? Did you know you wouldn't lose Magnolia Grove?" Dorothea considered this honestly. She said, "No, I didn't know." She said, "But your father knew." Isabel looked at the door, at the worn handle, at the simple white-painted wood of a building that had been 2 days away from being torn down for a parking expansion. She said, "What will you do with it?" Dorothea pushed the door open. The interior was as it had always been. 4 pews. The east-facing window, the light through it warm and specific in the late afternoon, falling on the simple altar Franklin had built himself the first winter after they moved to Magnolia Grove. She had asked him then why he was building a chapel when neither of them was particularly religious in the formal sense. He had said, "It's not for religion. It's for the kind of quiet that is hard to find anywhere else." She had understood what he meant. She stood in the doorway and looked at the pew on the left side, second from the front, the one where they had always sat on Sunday afternoons when the work was done, and the day had settled into its evening quality, and there was nothing required of either of them but to be present in a place they loved. Franklin had stood in this room on their private anniversary and said, "I don't promise you perfection. I promise you will always have this place to come home to." She stepped inside. She sat in the pew. She sat for a long time without speaking, and without needing to speak in the specific quality of silence that the chapel held. Not empty silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of a place that has been used for serious things and has become serious itself through the accumulation of that use. She felt in the way she had been feeling Franklin all week, not as a voice or an apparition, but as a quality of the space, the specific warmth of a place that has been loved by a person long enough that the person's love has become part of the room she felt him beside her. Not requiring anything, not speaking, simply present the way people are present in things they built and tended and cared about beyond what was practical or explainable. She sat with that. After a while, she said quietly to the afternoon light through the east window, "I'm going to open it, Franklin, the chapel, to whoever needs a quiet place, the way you built it, not for any particular purpose, just for the kind of quiet that is hard to find." The chapel was still. She said, "I think that's what you wanted. Not Magnolia Grove as a monument, not Magnolia Grove as a museum, just Magnolia Grove as a place that serves the people around it, the way it always has." She looked at the altar, at the simple wood of it, the careful joinery of a man who built things to last. She said, "I'll take care of it." Outside, through the east window, the November light was doing its last work on the garden, the roses in their winter canes, the old oaks at the property line, the gravel drive empty and quiet in the late afternoon. Magnolia Grove in November, the same as it had been in every November she had been here, the same as it would be in the next one and the one after that. She stayed until the light changed. Then she stood and smoothed her coat and walked out of the chapel and closed the door carefully behind her, the way you close a door on a room you intend to return to. She went back through the garden. She went inside. The house was warm and quiet around her. She was home. She had always been home. Franklin had made sure of it. Cecil Marsh came on a Tuesday morning. He called the evening before to ask if she was receiving visitors, which was the kind of courtesy that told her something about the man, that he understood the difference between being available and being ready, and that he would not assume one from the other. She said yes. Come for coffee. Come at 9. She made the good coffee, the kind Franklin had always requested on mornings when something important was going to be discussed, and she set out 2 cups and waited. He came through the front door at 9 exactly and took off his coat and his hat in the entry hall, the old gesture, the gesture of a man who was raised when you removed your hat indoors, as a matter of respect for the house and the people in it, and followed her to the kitchen. They sat at the table. The kitchen in November morning light was the same kitchen it had been for 22 years, the same window over the sink, the same ware on the wooden floor near the stove, the same corner where Franklin had always left his reading glasses, and where she had stopped herself twice this week from straightening them before remembering they were no longer there. Marsh wrapped both hands around his cup. He said, "I want to tell you how it began, if you want to know." She said, "I want to know everything." Franklin had called him on a Wednesday afternoon in March 2 years ago. Not an unusual call. They had spoken regularly throughout their long professional relationship, the easy communication of 2 people who have worked together long enough to dispense with preamble. But this call had a different quality, Marsh said. Franklin had asked if they could meet privately at Marsh's office without scheduling it through the usual channels. He had said he wanted to discuss something that required discretion. They met the following week. Franklin came in and sat down and said without introduction, "I want to protect Dot. I don't want to revise the will." Marsh had asked why not the will. Franklin had said, "Because Garrett will contest any new will I write. He will say I was influenced, that I was confused, that Dorothea pressured me into changing the distribution. He will have the old will. I know he knows about it. I know he has been looking at it, and he will use it as the baseline against which to challenge any revision. I don't want to give him a target." He had said, "I want to use a tool he can't attack through the will process. I want to move the property out of the estate entirely while I am alive and healthy and beyond any question of capacity, so that by the time he thinks to challenge anything, there is nothing in the estate to challenge." Marsh told her this slowly, in the unhurried manner of someone reconstructing a conversation he has thought about many times since it happened. He said Franklin had arrived at the meeting already knowing the broad shape of what he wanted had done. His own research had read about revocable living trusts and their treatment under state law, and the distinction between probate assets and trust assets, and what that distinction meant in practice when a family chose to contest an estate. Marsh said he was not a lawyer, but he had the mind of one, the kind of mind that identifies the exact question that needs answering and then finds the answer. He had identified that the will was the battlefield Garrett would choose, and he had decided to move the most important asset off that battlefield entirely. He had done it quietly, specifically, with a 2-year timeline that would make any subsequent challenge to his capacity implausible. Dorothea said he never told me what he was doing. Marsh said, "He told me why he didn't tell you. He said she heard in the way Marsh paused before this the specific quality of a man honoring a confidence and choosing how to honor it. He said the hardest moment of his life was not the illness. It was sitting at that table and signing the trust document, knowing he was preparing for a day when he would not be there to stand between you and what was coming. He said he told me he didn't tell you because he wanted to give you the years between the signing and the needing. He wanted you to have that time without the weight of knowing." The kitchen was quiet. Isabel was beside Dorothea. She had come down when she heard Marsh's voice had poured herself a cup, and sat at the end of the table and been quietly present in the way she was always present, neither intrusive nor absent. She did not speak. She listened. Marsh reached into his briefcase. He produced a small recording device, a simple digital recorder, the kind used for legal meetings and depositions, the kind that produces a clear and time-stamped record of what was said and when. He set it on the table between them. He said when we finished signing the documents, Franklin asked if I would record a statement. He wanted it on file. He wanted his voice and his reasoning to exist somewhere beyond the paper in case the paper was ever questioned. I told him I thought the documentation was sufficient. He said he wanted it anyway. He said I pressed record and he spoke for about 4 minutes. I have kept this in his file since that afternoon. I have not played it for anyone. He asked me to keep it until the right moment. He looked at Dorothea. He said, I think this is the right moment. He pressed play. Franklin's voice filled the kitchen. Clear, warm, unhurried, the specific timbre of him that she had known for 22 years, that she had heard say good morning and good night, and I love you, and look at the light on the garden, and we should plant a rose here. And so many other things now present in this room where he was not present, coming from a small recorder on the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in November. He said, my name is Franklin Whitmore. Today is March 14th, 2022. I have just signed a revocable living trust, transferring Magnolia Grove into trust with my wife Dorothea as co-trustee and sole surviving trustee. I want to state clearly for any record that may require it that I am signing this document of my own free will, with full understanding of its legal and financial implications, without pressure or influence from any person, including my wife, who does not know the full extent of what I am preparing today. He paused. He said, I am not doing this because I am angry at my son. I am doing this because Dorothea has spent 22 years building a life in that house, and she deserves to keep it without having to prove her right to anyone. She has never asked for anything except to be treated with the dignity she has earned. I am making sure that after I am gone, the law agrees with me on that point. He said Dot doesn't need to know how strong she is. I know enough for both of us. He said I trust her completely. I always have. This is simply me saying so in a language the county recorder will understand. The recording ended. The kitchen was quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that follows the voice of someone who is gone, not empty, not ordinary, the quiet that has the shape of the person in it. Isabel's hand found Dorothea's on the table. She held it. Dorothea sat with her eyes closed for a moment. Not crying, she had been through the crying, had done it in the days after the funeral in the private way she did most things, and what was left now was not grief exactly, but something fuller and more permanent, the feeling of being loved by someone who had thought further ahead than the immediate, and had trusted her completely with the evidence of that thinking. She sat for a long time. Then she opened her eyes. She stood up. She picked up the coffee pot from the counter and she refilled Marcia's cup and her own, and set it back and sat down again, and she looked at the recorder on the table and at Marsh and at Isabel and at the November light coming through the kitchen window. She said he always thought further ahead than I did, even now. Marsh said he thought further ahead than most people I've known in 40 years of this work. She said, was he afraid? Marsh considered the question the way he considered things that deserved a careful answer. He said not of what you might expect. He wasn't afraid of dying. He wasn't afraid of Garrett. He was afraid of one thing, that you would be in a room full of people who didn't see you clearly and that you would start to believe them. He said that was the thing he wanted to prevent most, not the legal outcome, the moment where you might have started to doubt yourself. She thought about the conference room, about sitting across from Garrett with the Navy folder on the table and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said, because Franklin had already said everything, about the hallway and the brass keys and the physician's statement and the letter that began, if this letter is being opened, then Garrett has tried everything available to him, and everything was insufficient. She had not doubted herself, not once. She said he succeeded. Marsh said yes. He did. She looked at the recorder. She said, can I keep this? Marsh said it was always yours. 1 year later, the rose garden was the most beautiful it had ever been. Isabel said it was probably because no one had pruned them too early this year, that the roses had been allowed to come in on their own schedule at the pace the season required, rather than the pace someone else had decided for them. Dorothea thought Isabel was right about that. She thought about it on the May morning she walked the garden and found all 22 canes in full bloom, the deep reds and the pale pinks and the cream-colored ones. Franklin had always called the difficult ones the ones that needed the most attention to produce the most return, and she stood in the middle of them and breathed the specific air of a rose garden in its best season and thought he would have liked this. He would have stood exactly here and looked at exactly this and said something quiet and specific about the light or the soil or the particular variety in the south corner that had taken 3 years to establish and was now the strongest one in the bed. He would have been right about whatever he said. He usually was. The chapel opened on the first Sunday in March. Dorothea had done it simply a notice at the county bulletin board and at the library and at the church down the road, a handwritten card that said the chapel at Magnolia Grove would be open Sunday mornings for anyone who needed a quiet place. No requirement of any kind, come and sit for as long as you need. She had not advertised it as a memorial or a tribute. She had advertised it as what Franklin had built it to be, a place for the kind of quiet that was hard to find anywhere else. 7 people came the first Sunday, 14 the second. By April, it had become a thing the community knew about in the way communities know about things that serve a genuine need, not with fanfare, not with formal announcement, but with the quiet, reliable word of mouth of people, telling other people that there was somewhere to go when you needed to go somewhere. She had started the garden classes in April as well. 6 women the first week. All of them older, all of them with some connection to land, a daughter who had inherited a property and didn't know what to do with it, a woman who had gardened for 30 years and wanted to go deeper, a retired school teacher who said she had always wanted to learn but had never had the time. They came on Wednesday mornings, and Dorothea took them through the garden and showed them what Franklin had shown her, which was not primarily about horticulture, but about attention, about the specific practice of paying close enough attention to a living thing to understand what it needed and when. Magnolia Grove had become what Franklin had always wanted it to be. Not a showpiece, not a hotel, not an investment vehicle or a development opportunity or anything that converted its value into a number. A living place. A place that served the people around it. A place in relationship with its community, held by someone who understood that holding something properly meant allowing it to give what it had to give. Garrett's trial was scheduled for the fall. Marsh had told her the broad shape of it, the charges, the legal timeline, the likely proceedings. She had listened and asked the questions that needed asking and had not asked the ones that didn't. She did not spend much time thinking about Garrett. Not from hardness or from the deliberate effort of forgiveness, simply from the understanding that thinking about Garrett was not a good use of the attention she had available. Pamela had filed for divorce in February. Marsh had mentioned it once briefly with the neutral professional delivery he used for information that was factual rather than personal. Dorothea had nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me," and they had moved on to the next item. She had no feelings about Pamela that required further examination. She had observations that greed pursued past a certain point tends to consume its own partnerships as readily as anything else, but observations were not feelings, and they did not require her time. She had other things to give her time to. On a Saturday afternoon in May, she framed the folder. She had been thinking about it since March, how to do it, whether to do it, what form it should take. The navy folder with its white ribbon still partially tied was not an ordinary keepsake. It was not a decoration. It was the thing Franklin had called her armor, the thing he had prepared over 2 years of careful thinking and had placed in her hands with the specific instruction that she would know when to open it. She had known when. She had opened it. It had done what he built it to do. She bought a frame that was deep enough to accommodate the folder's thickness, a simple frame, good wood, clean glass, the kind that held something without making a fuss about the holding. She placed the folder inside it as it was navy cloth cover. The white ribbon still partially tied the tab that read, "Franklin and Dorothea Whitmore Family Trust," visible through the glass. She hung it in the entrance hall. to the left of the main door at eye level in the natural sight line of anyone entering Magnolia Grove. Beside it on the right, the frame wedding photograph, the one taken in the garden, the afternoon of their private ceremony, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said, the chapel visible behind them in the summer light. The folder on the left, the photograph on the right. She had made a small card written by hand on the good notepaper she used for correspondence that mattered. She placed it below the frame on the narrow shelf that ran beneath both pieces. He protected her. She kept his promise. She stood back and looked at them. She thought about Franklin on the last evening he was well enough to sit in the entrance hall, the evening he had stopped at the grandfather clock and wound it the way he always wound it, and then stood for a moment looking at the hall around him with the expression she had learned to read as a man memorizing something. He had said, "Dot, this house knows who it belongs to. You just have to stay." She had stayed. Isabel came to stand beside her. They stood together in the entrance hall of Magnolia Grove, the two of them mother and daughter in the warm afternoon light that came through the tall windows and fell on the wooden floor and on the framed folder and on the wedding photograph and on the grandfather clock in its corner ticking with the steady patience of something that has been keeping time through everything and intends to go on keeping it. The clock. Franklin had wound it every Sunday for 30 years. She had wound it last Sunday for the first time, standing at the case with the small key in her hand, doing it the way he had shown her, slowly, carefully feeling the mechanism catch. She intended to wind it every Sunday from now on. Isabel said quietly, "He knew exactly what he was doing when he married you." Dorothea said he knew exactly what he was doing in everything. She looked at the folder in its frame, at the white ribbon, at the tab with both their names on it. She said he didn't leave me a building. He left me armor. And I only needed enough courage to put it on. Isabel took her hand. They stood in the hall together for a while, not needing to say anything further, in the specific comfortable silence of two people who are in the right place and know it. Dorothea went out to the front porch in the early evening. The old oaks lined the drive the way they had lined it for 100 years, tall, unhurried, their roots going deep into the savanna earth in the way of things that have been given enough time to become permanent. The May light was doing what May light did in the late afternoon, going golden and long, finding the angles that showed the property at its most itself. She stood on the porch and looked at the drive and the oaks and the rose garden visible at the side of the house, and the chapel white in the garden beyond it, and the fields running to the property line where the old oaks stood. A light wind moved through the trees. Magnolia Grove stood quiet and complete in its spring evening as it had stood for 100 years through 3 generations of Whitmores and 22 years of a marriage that had made it what it now was, as it would stand for whatever came next. She stood on the porch with her hand on the railing and breathed the evening air of a place she had been trusted with and had proved worthy of the trust. Franklin had said, "The house knows who it belongs to." The house knew. She went inside. The clock was ticking in the hall. The folder was on the wall. The roses were in bloom. She was home.